January 12, 1943. 4:47 a.m. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Major Klaus Steiner stood in what remained of a department store basement, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Around him, 43 men from the 389th Infantry Division huddled against concrete walls blackened by fire. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 32 degrees Celsius. Inside wasn't much warmer. Steiner was 34 years old. A career officer. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1932 before Hitler came to power, drawn by family tradition rather than ideology. His grandfather had served in the Franco-Prussian War. His father had survived Verdun. Now here he was, promoted to major just 6 weeks earlier, commanding what remained of a battalion that had numbered 800 men when they'd crossed into Soviet territory 18 months ago. He pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket. His last one. The supply lines into the Stalingrad pocket had been cut for weeks. No food. No ammunition. No tobacco. He lit it anyway, taking a slow drag as he reviewed the intelligence report that had arrived 2 hours earlier by motorcycle courier. The paper was stained with someone else's blood. The report detailed Soviet troop movements. 3 fresh infantry divisions moving into position north of the Kessel, the pocket that enclosed what remained of the German 6th Army. Another 2 divisions approaching from the south. Artillery batteries setting up along the entire perimeter. The numbers were staggering. 150,000 Soviet troops surrounding 70,000 Germans. Steiner read the report twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his leather map case. He didn't share the details with his men. They could see the situation for themselves. Every day the perimeter shrank. Every night more positions fell to Soviet assault. The 6th Army was dying meter by meter, in the ruins of a city they'd been promised would fall in a week. But Steiner still believed they would break out. He had to. The alternative was unthinkable. Germany didn't lose wars. Germany didn't abandon entire armies. Field Marshal Paulus had been promised relief. Hitler himself had guaranteed that the Luftwaffe would supply the pocket until Manstein's panzers broke through to rescue them. You didn't doubt the Führer. You didn't question the chain of command. You held your position and waited for orders. Steiner had fought in Poland in 1939. That campaign lasted 5 weeks. He'd been in France in 1940, watching French armies collapse in just 6 weeks of fighting. He'd seen the Wehrmacht at its height, unstoppable, professional, convinced of its own superiority. Every battle had been a victory. Every campaign a triumph. The German soldier was the best trained, best led fighting man in the world. Everyone knew this. It was simple fact. Even here in Stalingrad, even surrounded and starving, most men still believed relief would come. You heard it in the conversations between soldiers huddled around oil drum fires. The panzers are coming. Manstein won't abandon us. The Luftwaffe is flying in supplies. We just need to hold a few more days. The faith was remarkable considering the evidence around them. Steiner walked through the ruined department store, checking on his men. Corporal Heinrich sat with his back against a wall, staring at nothing. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from a dead comrade's uniform. Frostbite had claimed 3 of his fingers 2 days earlier. The battalion surgeon had amputated them with a pocket knife and no anesthetic. Heinrich hadn't screamed. He'd bitten through a leather belt instead. Private Vogel was cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that hour. It was something to do. A routine that suggested normalcy. Steiner watched him work the bolt action, clearing imaginary frost from the mechanism. Vogel's rifle had no ammunition. They'd run out yesterday. But he cleaned it anyway, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into him during training. Sergeant Krauss approached from the stairwell leading to the upper floors. His face was gray with cold and exhaustion. The position on the north wall is gone, he reported quietly. Soviets overran it at 0300. 22 men. None made it back. Steiner absorbed this information without expression. 22 more names for the casualty list. The battalion was down to company strength. The company was down to platoon strength. Soon they'd be counting individuals. Pull everyone back to this floor, Steiner ordered. Barricade the stairwells. We'll hold here until relief arrives. Krauss didn't question the order. He simply nodded and moved to execute it. That was the Wehrmacht way. Orders were orders. You followed them even when they made no sense, even when you suspected they were leading you to death. Outside, the Soviet artillery began its morning barrage. The building shook. Dust and fragments of plaster fell from the ceiling. The men didn't flinch. They'd learned to distinguish between dangerous fire and harassment fire. This was harassment. The Soviets were saving their heavy shells for later. They had plenty of ammunition. They could afford to be patient. Steiner pulled out his map and studied it by candlelight. The map showed the Stalingrad pocket as it had existed 3 weeks earlier. A rough circle perhaps 30 kilometers across. But that map was already obsolete. The pocket had shrunk by half. German-held territory was now a narrow strip along the western bank of the Volga River, barely 15 kilometers long and perhaps 5 kilometers wide at its widest point. He traced the defensive line with his finger. Factory district to the north, held by remnants of 4 divisions. City center where his own unit was positioned. Southern suburbs where the last tanks sat motionless, out of fuel. And beyond the perimeter, Soviet forces in numbers that seemed to multiply daily. The mathematics were simple. 70,000 Germans surrounded by 250,000 Soviets. The 6th Army consumed roughly 500 tons of supplies daily just to survive. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. The Luftwaffe was managing to fly in perhaps 70 tons per day, and that only when weather permitted. The shortfall was killing them as surely as Soviet bullets. But Steiner didn't think in terms of mathematics. He thought in terms of duty. His duty was to hold this position. His duty was to maintain discipline among his men. His duty was to wait for orders and execute them regardless of personal cost. That was what being an officer meant. The Wehrmacht had drilled this into him for 11 years. So he waited. And believed. Because the alternative, accepting that they were abandoned, that relief wasn't coming, that the 6th Army would die here in the ruins of Stalingrad, that was impossible to accept. Not yet. January 14, 1943. 2:15 p.m. The motorcycle courier arrived during the afternoon lull in fighting. Steiner heard the engine before he saw it, a distinctive BMW R75 with sidecar, navigating through rubble-choked streets at dangerous speed. The rider wore a white winter camouflage cape over his Feldgrau uniform. His face was hidden behind goggles and a scarf wrapped against the cold. He stopped outside the department store entrance, killed the engine and climbed off stiffly. Steiner recognized the insignia of Army Group Headquarters. This wasn't a routine supply run or casualty report. This was something official. Something that required a human messenger rather than radio transmission. The courier entered the basement, removed his goggles and saluted. "Major Steiner?" Steiner nodded. The courier reached inside his coat and withdrew a leather dispatch case. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Official Wehrmacht stationery. Typed orders. Signed by Field Marshal Paulus himself. Steiner read the orders once. Then twice. Then a third time, certain he must have misunderstood. But the words didn't change. They were clear and direct in the way German military orders always were. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. All units were to prepare for final defensive positions. Breakout was no longer being considered. The 6th Army would fight where it stood. Surrender was expressly forbidden. Units would defend their positions to the last man and last bullet. Steiner looked up from the paper. "When did this come through?" "This morning, sir. Every battalion commander in the pocket is receiving the same orders." The courier's voice was matter-of-fact. He was just delivering messages. It wasn't his job to understand them. Steiner dismissed the man and sat down heavily on a wooden crate. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Final defensive positions. That phrase meant something specific in Wehrmacht doctrine. It meant you weren't holding ground to buy time for a counterattack. You weren't holding ground until relief arrived. You were holding ground because there was nowhere else to go. Final meant final. It meant death. For the first time since arriving in Stalingrad, Steiner allowed himself to fully consider what he'd been avoiding for weeks. The Luftwaffe couldn't supply the pocket. Everyone knew this now. The transport planes were being shot down faster than they could deliver supplies. The 6th Army consumed more in a day than the Luftwaffe could deliver in a week. Manstein's relief attempt had failed. Everyone knew this too, though no one said it aloud. The panzers had gotten within 30 kilometers of the pocket before being driven back by Soviet counterattacks. That had been 3 weeks ago. No second attempt was coming. If Manstein couldn't break through with fresh troops and full fuel supplies, he certainly couldn't do it now. And Hitler's promise that Germany would never abandon the 6th Army, that promise was being kept in the most literal and terrible way possible. The 6th Army wouldn't be abandoned. It would be ordered to die in place. Fighting to the last man wasn't rhetoric. It was official policy now, documented in orders signed by the Field Marshal commanding. Steiner folded the orders carefully and placed them in his map case next to the intelligence reports. He didn't call his officers together to share this information. Not yet. He needed time to process it first. Time to reconcile what he'd believed for 11 years with what he now understood to be true. January 18, 1943. Morning. The food ran out completely that day. Not reduced rations or quarter rations. Actually, completely gone. The last of the frozen horse meat had been distributed 2 days earlier. The last of the hard bread was consumed yesterday. Now there was nothing but melted snow to drink in silence where there should have been the sound of men eating. Steiner watched his soldiers' faces change. Hunger was different from everything else about Stalingrad. You could adapt to cold. You could function in combat despite fear. But hunger wasn't something you adjusted to. It consumed you from inside. It made simple movements exhausting. It made thinking difficult. It turned proud Wehrmacht soldiers into hollow-eyed ghosts who could barely lift their weapons. Corporal Heinrich died that morning. Not from his frostbitten hands. Not from Soviet fire. From starvation and cold combined into something that just made his heart stop. He died in his sleep, which was mercy. Sergeant Kraus found him during morning rounds, frozen solid in his sleeping position, his face peaceful. They left him there. Moving the body would waste calories they didn't have. That afternoon, Steiner made his first independent decision that contradicted orders. He authorized his men to break into civilian buildings searching for anything edible. This was technically looting. It violated Wehrmacht regulations. It was the kind of thing Soviet troops did. But regulations written in Berlin meant nothing here in the ruins where his men were literally starving to death. They found almost nothing. Stalingrad's civilian population, those who hadn't evacuated or been killed, had already stripped the city bare. But Private Vogel discovered a cellar with 36 potatoes, frozen solid but still edible. The men divided them carefully. 12 men. 3 potatoes each. Steiner took his share and ate one raw. It tasted like the finest meal he'd ever had. The next contradiction to orders came 2 days later. A Soviet propaganda leaflet was dropped on their position. Thousands of them fluttered down like snow, landing in the rubble, covering bodies, sticking to frozen walls. Regulations required that these leaflets be collected and burned without being read. Propaganda was dangerous to morale. Soldiers were to have no contact with enemy psychological operations materials. Steiner read one anyway. He couldn't help himself. The text was in decent German, clearly written by someone who understood how to reach Wehrmacht soldiers. It contained a list of towns and cities on the Soviet side of the front. Next to each location was a number representing the Soviet forces stationed there. The numbers were staggering. Divisions where German intelligence believed there were only regiments. Armies where they thought there were divisions. At the bottom of the leaflet was a simple message. German soldiers, you are surrounded by forces 10 times your number. Your relief attempt failed. Your resupply attempts are failing. Your situation is hopeless. Lay down your weapons. You will be treated according to international law. You will live to see your families again. Continue fighting and you will die in these ruins for nothing. Steiner should have burned it. Instead, he folded it and kept it with his orders. Because he knew something now that he couldn't unknow. The numbers were probably accurate. The Soviets had no reason to exaggerate. They were winning. Their propaganda was most effective when it was simply true. That night, Lieutenant Werner approached him in the darkness. Werner was 23 years old. He'd been commissioned 6 months ago, pulled straight from officer training school and sent east. His entire military experience consisted of Stalingrad. He'd never known anything but siege and starvation. Sir, the men are asking questions, Werner said quietly. They want to know when relief is coming. They want to know how long we're expected to hold. They want to know. He trailed off. Steiner waited. They want to know if anyone is coming for us at all. This was the question Steiner had been avoiding answering even to himself. But Werner deserved honesty. His men deserved honesty. They were dying for something, and they had a right to know whether that something was victory or simply obedience. No one is coming, Steiner said finally. Manstein's relief attempt failed. The supply flights are insufficient. We've been ordered to fight in place until ammunition is exhausted. He watched Werner's face as this information settled. The young officer's expression didn't change much. He'd probably already suspected. But hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting. Then what are we fighting for? Werner asked. It wasn't defiant. It was genuine confusion. Steiner had no good answer to give him. January 22, 1943. Late afternoon. The Soviet final assault began with artillery fire that turned the frozen air to fire. Steiner had experienced heavy bombardments before, Poland, France, the drive into Russia. But nothing prepared him for this. The Soviets weren't trying to soften defensive positions. They were trying to erase the pocket from existence. Shells fell in patterns that walked through their positions with mathematical precision. The building shook. Walls collapsed. Men screamed. Those who'd survived Stalingrad this long knew the drill. Press yourself into the smallest possible space, cover your head, pray the next shell lands somewhere else. There was no returning fire. They had almost no ammunition left to respond with. When the bombardment lifted after 40 minutes, Steiner's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear Sergeant Kraus screaming that Soviet infantry was advancing. He pulled himself up from behind the concrete wall he'd sheltered behind and looked through a gap in the rubble. They came in waves. Brown-coated Soviet infantry advancing through smoke and dust, rifles at the ready, moving with the confidence of an army that knew it was winning. Behind them came T-34 tanks, their engines roaring, their main guns firing into German positions from point-blank range. This wasn't a probe or a limited attack. This was the final push. Steiner's battalion, now barely 30 men, fired back with what little they had. A few rifles with magazines containing perhaps 3 bullets each. One MG-42 machine gun with a half-belt of ammunition. A single Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon they'd been saving for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. Private Vogel fired the Panzerfaust at a T-34 that was crushing through their defensive wall. The shaped charge struck the tank's side armor and detonated. The explosion was massive. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from its hatches. But 3 more tanks were right behind it, and Vogel had no more ammunition. He threw the launcher aside and picked up his rifle. Empty. He threw that aside too and simply stood there, weaponless, as Soviet infantry approached. Steiner shot twice with his Luger pistol. Both shots hit. Both Soviet soldiers fell. That left him with 3 rounds. 3 rounds against thousands of advancing soldiers. The mathematics of defeat expressed in the simplest possible terms. The defense collapsed quickly after that. Not because the men were cowards. Not because they gave up. But because you can't fight without ammunition. You can't hold positions without walls to hide behind. You can't maintain discipline when your officers are dead and your orders are meaningless. Sergeant Krauss went down with a bullet through his chest. He clutched at Steiner's coat as he fell, blood bright against the snow. His lips moved but no sound came out. Then he stopped moving entirely. 14 years in the Wehrmacht. Campaigns in 3 countries. Dead in a Russian basement in a battle that had already been lost. Lieutenant Werner was killed by a tank shell that detonated against the wall behind him. The blast threw his body 15 meters. When Steiner found him, there was nothing recognizable left. Just meat and uniform fragments scattered across frozen concrete. He was 23 years old. He'd been married for 6 months. His wife didn't know he was dead yet. She wouldn't know for weeks, maybe months. By late evening, the position was overrun. Soviet soldiers moved through the ruined department store systematically, clearing each floor, each room, each corner. Steiner was in what remained of the basement with 11 other survivors. They had no ammunition. They had no options. They had orders that said fight to the last bullet. But bullets were gone. What did orders mean when they became physically impossible to follow? Steiner looked at the 11 men with him. 11 soldiers who'd done everything asked of them. They'd fought across Poland and France and Russia. They'd held Stalingrad for months against overwhelming odds. They'd obeyed every order without question. And now they were being asked to die for no tactical advantage, no strategic purpose, no achievable objective. A Soviet officer appeared at the basement entrance, flanked by 4 armed soldiers. He spoke German with an educated accent. German soldiers, you have no ammunition. You have no support. You have no hope of relief. Lay down your weapons. You will not be harmed. This is your last chance. Steiner looked at the 11 faces staring at him, waiting for his decision. Orders said fight to the last man. But orders also said relief was coming. Orders said the Luftwaffe would supply them. Orders said a lot of things that turned out to be lies. January 23, 1943. 7 a.m. Major Klaus Steiner sat in a Soviet interrogation room in a building that had once been a grain elevator. The room was warm, the first warm room he'd experienced in weeks. The walls were intact. A functioning heater radiated heat in the corner. Simple wooden chairs. A table. One Soviet officer sitting across from him, smoking a cigarette and reviewing paperwork. Steiner and his 11 men had surrendered the previous evening. No heroic last stand. No dramatic final battle. They'd simply laid down their empty weapons and raised their hands. Steiner had expected to be shot. Executing prisoners was common enough on both sides. But the Soviets had simply disarmed them, given them water, and marched them under guard to a collection point. The Soviet officer looked up from his papers. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the worn face of someone who'd seen too much war. He spoke in German. Major Klaus Steiner, 389th Infantry Division. Correct. Steiner nodded. You joined the Wehrmacht in 1932. You were in Poland, France, and Operation Barbarossa. You've been at Stalingrad for 6 months. All of this was correct. Steiner didn't know how they knew so much. Captured documents probably. Or maybe they'd been monitoring radio traffic for months and had built complete profiles of every German officer in the pocket. It didn't matter now. I'm not required to answer questions, Steiner said. Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. The Soviet officer smiled slightly. You're correct. You're not required. But I'm not interested in military secrets, Major. I doubt you know anything that would help us at this point. The battle is over. The 6th Army is finished. Steiner said nothing. The officer continued. I'm interested in understanding something. Why did you keep fighting? For the last 3 weeks, you must have known relief wasn't coming. You must have known you were going to die here. Yet you continued. Why? Was a good question. Steiner had asked himself the same thing dozens of times since reading Paulus's final orders. Why keep fighting when the outcome was certain? Why follow orders that guaranteed death? Why maintain discipline when discipline was leading directly to annihilation? Orders, Steiner said finally. We had orders to hold position. Officers don't question orders. The Soviet officer nodded thoughtfully. Yes, orders. The German military is famous for following orders. But you're an intelligent man, Major. You can read a map. You understand logistics. You knew those orders were sending you to your death. You chose to follow them anyway. That word chose struck Steiner hard. Because it was true. He'd had choices. He could have refused orders. He could have broken out with his men when the perimeter was weaker. He could have surrendered earlier, saving lives. But he'd chosen to follow orders because that's what Wehrmacht officers did. Even when orders made no sense. Even when orders meant death. I was trained to follow orders, Steiner replied. For 11 years. Since before Hitler came to power. The Wehrmacht doesn't function without discipline and obedience. If every officer decided which orders to follow and which to ignore, there would be chaos. And following those orders brought you victory in Poland and France. But here in Russia? The Soviet officer gestured vaguely eastward. Here your obedience brought defeat. Steiner felt something inside him crack at those words. Not anger. Not denial. But recognition. Because it was true. Germany had won when its professional army was fighting professional armies with comparable resources. But against the Soviet Union, with its endless reserves of men and material, its willingness to trade casualties at ratios that would have destroyed any European army, German discipline and training weren't enough. The numbers told the story. The entire German 6th Army at Stalingrad had numbered roughly 250,000 men at its height. The Soviets had lost more than that taking the city and still had reserves to continue fighting. Germany couldn't replace those losses. The Soviet Union could. It was mathematics. It was industrial capacity. It was population. All the things Wehrmacht training didn't account for. When did you realize you were going to lose? The Soviet officer asked quietly. It was the question Steiner had been avoiding answering even to himself. The Soviet officer waited patiently for Steiner's answer. In the silence, Steiner replayed the last 6 months in his mind. Not the battles or the heroism, but the small details that added up to inevitable defeat. December 19th, Steiner said finally. That's when I knew. The officer raised an eyebrow. Not when the pocket was formed. Not when relief failed. But December 19th specifically? That was the day supply flights completely failed, Steiner explained. The Luftwaffe promised 500 tons daily. They'd been delivering perhaps 70 tons on good days. On December 19th the weather was perfect. Clear skies. No Soviet fighters reported in the corridor. Conditions couldn't have been better. And they delivered 24 tons. 24 tons for an army of 250,000 men. That's when I understood the promises were lies. Not mistakes. Not optimistic planning. Was. The Luftwaffe couldn't supply us. Command knew this. Hitler knew this. But they kept telling us relief was coming. Keep fighting. Keep holding. Help is on the way. The Soviet officer nodded slowly. And yet you continued fighting for another 5 weeks after you knew the promises were lies. Steiner had no good answer to that. Training, he said weakly. Discipline. Duty. I don't know. We just kept going. Because that's what we'd always done. You followed orders even after you knew the war was lost, the officer said. It wasn't a question. At Stalingrad, yes. But beyond Stalingrad? Germany is losing everywhere. You know this. Your intelligence officers know this. Your high command knows this. When will German soldiers stop following orders that lead to death? That question echoed in the warm room. Steiner thought about the Wehrmacht, the institution he'd devoted his adult life to. The pride he'd felt serving in what everyone said was the finest army in the world. The victories in Poland and France that proved German military supremacy. The confidence with which they'd invaded the Soviet Union, certain of quick victory. And then reality. The endless Soviet divisions. The T-34 tanks that outclassed German armor. The winter that killed men as effectively as bullets. The supply lines stretched too thin. The cities that should have fallen in weeks but held for months. Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad. Each one a promise of victory that became a graveyard. I don't know, Steiner admitted. I don't know when German soldiers will stop following orders. We're trained from day one that obedience is everything. Question nothing. Execute orders without hesitation. It's what makes the Wehrmacht effective. But here. He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the walls around them. Here it just made us effective at dying. The Soviet officer leaned back in his chair. Your Field Marshal Paulus surrendered this morning. Along with 15 other generals and 90,000 soldiers. The battle is over. Stalingrad has fallen. Steiner absorbed this information without expression. It wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that it had taken this long. How many? Steiner asked. How many of the 6th Army are left? The Soviet officer consulted his papers. We're still counting. But approximately 90,000 prisoners. Perhaps 30,000 dead. The rest, scattered, frozen or fled. Of the 250,000 who entered Stalingrad, very few will see Germany again. 250,000 men. An entire army. Germany's finest formations. Destroyed in a single battle because orders said hold position and Wehrmacht discipline said obey without question. February 1943. Prisoner of war camp somewhere in the Soviet Union. The camp was a collection of barracks behind barbed wire, holding what remained of the 6th Army. Steiner shared a room with 32 other officers. Former battalion commanders. former regimental staff, former men of authority and responsibility, now reduced to prisoners waiting for a war to end. They talked sometimes in quiet conversations that circled around what they'd experienced. No one wanted to directly acknowledge that they'd served in a catastrophic defeat, that they'd followed orders that led to the destruction of an entire army, that their professional military training had been insufficient against Soviet determination and resources. But the knowledge was there in every conversation. You could hear it in the questions no one asked aloud. What was it all for? Why did we keep fighting when defeat was certain? How many men died because we followed orders without question? And the biggest question of all, is Germany going to lose this war? Steiner learned from new prisoners arriving daily that the situation was deteriorating across the entire Eastern Front. Army Group South was in retreat. Army Group North was besieged at Leningrad. Army Group Center was struggling to maintain positions against Soviet winter offensives. Everywhere the Wehrmacht was giving ground it would never recapture. In March he met a colonel who'd been captured at Kharkov. The colonel spoke bitterly about orders from Berlin that made no tactical sense. Hold cities that should have been evacuated. Defend positions that could have been bypassed. Stand and fight when maneuver would have saved divisions. The same pattern that had killed the 6th Army was being repeated across the entire front. They're going to lose the war, the colonel said quietly one night. Germany, they're going to lose the entire war. Not just battles. Not just campaigns. Everything. Because no one at high command will acknowledge reality. They keep issuing orders based on ideology rather than military possibility. And good soldiers keep following those orders right into destruction. Steiner didn't argue. He'd reached the same conclusion weeks earlier, sitting in that Soviet interrogation room. Germany was losing. Not might lose. Was losing. The only question was how long it would take and how many more soldiers would die following orders before someone in Berlin admitted the truth. 1956. 13 years after Stalingrad. West Germany. Klaus Steiner, no longer major, no longer Wehrmacht, stood in a civilian cemetery outside Munich. He was visiting the grave of Sergeant Krauss, whose body had been recovered after the war and returned to Germany for burial. The headstone was simple. Name, rank, dates. Born 1909. Died 1943. Stalingrad. Steiner came here occasionally. Not from guilt, though guilt was part of it. Not from duty, though duty was also part of it. But from a need to remember something important. Something about following orders without question. Something about discipline that becomes complicity. The Soviet officer's question still echoed in his mind 13 years later. Why did you keep fighting when you knew you were going to lose? Steiner had spent years thinking about that answer. The simple answer was training and discipline. But the deeper answer was more uncomfortable. He'd kept fighting because accepting defeat meant accepting that everything he'd believed about the Wehrmacht, about German military superiority, about the rightness of his cause, all of it was wrong. Admitting defeat meant admitting he'd wasted his career in service to something fundamentally flawed. So he'd kept following orders because that was easier than facing the truth. But the truth had found him anyway. In the ruins of Stalingrad. In a Soviet interrogation room. In a POW camp where Wehrmacht officers discussed how their army was losing the war they'd been promised they'd win. Germany had surrendered in May 1945. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12 years. The Wehrmacht that was supposed to be invincible was defeated on every front. Steiner thought about his men. The ones who died following his orders. The ones who died following orders from field marshals and generals who should have known better. All those soldiers who did their duty, who maintained discipline, who followed orders without question right into death. What had they died for? Not for victory, that had been impossible for years before they died. Not for Germany, their deaths hadn't saved Germany, only prolonged its suffering. They died for obedience itself. For the principle that orders must be followed regardless of circumstances. For discipline elevated above judgment. That was the lesson Steiner carried from Stalingrad. Not that discipline is bad. Not that orders should be ignored. But that discipline without judgment is dangerous. That following orders without questioning their purpose makes you complicit in outcomes you never intended. That duty to command must be balanced against duty to the men under your command. He placed flowers on Krauss's grave. 14 years in the Wehrmacht. Dead in a battle that was lost before he died. Following orders that should never have been given. Serving with honor in a cause that history would judge harshly. Steiner walked back through the cemetery toward the gate. Behind him, row after row of headstones marked the graves of men who died in the war. Stalingrad. Normandy. Berlin. Each stone representing a soldier who'd followed orders. Each stone representing a life ended in service to something that couldn't be saved by discipline alone. The day a German officer realized Germany was already lost wasn't a single day. It was a slow accumulation of evidence that duty forced him to ignore until ignoring it became impossible. It was mathematics asserting itself over ideology. It was reality defeating belief. And the terrible truth was this. Even after he knew, even after he realized defeat was certain, he kept fighting. Because that's what his training demanded. Because that's what Wehrmacht discipline required. Because admitting the truth would have broken something fundamental about how he understood his role. So he followed orders into capture. And spent the rest of his life wondering if obedience without question is really the highest military virtue, or if sometimes the hardest order to follow is the one that tells you to stop following orders. In the cemetery outside Munich, the wind moved through the trees. The headstones stood silent. And Klaus Steiner, former major in the Wehrmacht, walked away carrying knowledge that came too late to save anyone, including himself.